Haha, there we go. And share my screen. This is week 12, according to my count of the weeks, which apparently goes against the way the school counts. But since I'm in an angry mode with them, then I don't care how they're counting weeks. And in my count, there's 15 weeks and then the final exams week. But this week we're finishing off the Romans, and I will actually start talking. Oh, I clicked the wrong one again. Um, and and I'll be starting to talk about religion, right? So I'm actually going to put the monotheistic religions together. So we'll talk about Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. As we work up to next week, we will be working on the primary source analysis number 2. So if anybody wants to get started with the reading for next week, you can start. So I can give you a short intro today on it. For next week, you're just going to be reading The Passion of Perpetua and Felicity. This is a document. It's actually a diary of a Christian woman who ends up becoming a martyr. This is under the Roman Empire. She writes a diary in which she describes her experiences in a Roman jail. She was imprisoned for being Christian and because she refused to renounce her Christianity. In the document, I've also scanned in pages that give you a description. I wouldn't skip the description, I at least skim it so that you get a sense of some of the background here, right? But and then the history of the text is also important because once you get to the actual document itself, it starts here, The Passion of Perpetua and Felicity. You'll notice that there's a kind of narrator at the beginning and at the end of the story. And so while this is her diary and it's largely authentic, we can also tell that somebody added things to this document at some point after Perpetua wrote her diary in jail, right? And so that might change what analysis, how you read. That should change to some degree how you read the document, knowing that somebody went in afterwards to add things, right? And so this is a kind of very typical story of the way the stories of martyrs were written, right? And why they become so important in terms of promoting Christianity. And this will be, we'll talk about how this is very similar to Islam as well. Not so much to Judaism, but these stories of martyrs become very important in early Christianity and also in Islam. So it's not super long. I don't think it's super long, but you might. So if you want to get started with it, so I would say to start it now, and look at the prompt. Right, you always want to read the assignment or the reading based on what you're going to have to write on it. And for this one, I'm going to give you a choice of which questions you answer. Right, there's going to be there's 2 prompts essentially. In one of the prompts, I asked you to pay attention to the role that gender played in the story of Perpetua. Right? And we will talk about, you know, traditional gender roles versus the kind of gender roles that the church offers women via martyrdom. Right? We tend to think of the church as being very traditional in terms of gender roles. But in early Christianity, the church offered women in particular something different than traditional gender roles via the ability to be martyrs. So pay attention to that. There's also, so in her diary, Perpetua describes having visions. And in these visions, sometimes she sees herself as a woman and sometimes she sees herself as a man in her visions. So if you're interested in topics of gender, there's some really interesting things happening in that story. But if you're not interested in gender, then your other option is talking about the whole story of martyrs, right? Because this is a very typical martyr story, you can pick out what makes for a good martyr story. What are the key elements of it? And also, what is up with that narrator at the beginning and at the end? Why are those things there? How do they shape the story of Perpetua as a martyr, right? And here is where, I'm like, you can go a lot of different ways with this theme. I have had in the past, last time I used this source, I had students who were Christian and religious get a kind of very religious meaning out of it. And I also had students that were much more critical of Christianity also read the same document and give me a very different interpretation of martyrdom and the way it works, the way it worked in the early church. So there's a lot you can do there, and there's again no right and wrong. It's more about your own analysis of that source. So um, we'll we'll spend a lot of time next week talking about the story of Perpetua and kind of extracting a lot of meaning out of that source. But I wanted to bring it up now because you can start reading that now. You just need to know these things before you go in. The other key element you should know before you read it is that it's set in Roman Africa. It is in Africa. It's the Roman Empire, but it's not. I'm like, usually when we read documents that in Rome, we imagine, sorry, in the Roman Empire, we imagine it's in Rome. This is not, right? So it's in Roman Africa, still the Roman Empire, but it's third century towards the end of the Roman Empire. So does anybody have questions about this now? Time goes by fast. Gerardo. Yes, this is why I'm bringing it up now. No questions so far? All right, you'll start looking at that. And once you have questions, feel free to ask me about them whenever you get started with it. Yep. Yeah, Gerardo, I see that. So basically you read the source and then you answer one of the two prompts. Do not answer both prompts. I will repeat, I will send out emails. You do not answer both prompts. That would make a terrible paper if you try to answer both prompts. I'm like, it's either a long paper or a really long bad or a really long paper. So we don't want that. Uh, so let's get started then finishing up talking about Rome this week. Let's see, daily life in the Roman Empire. Here we go. So one of the most interesting things about Rome and things that we like to connect ourselves to is a lot of the technology that existed in the Roman Empire. A lot of it began during the Roman Republic, but largely developed during the Roman Empire. The thing to remember as I talked about some of this technology is a lot of it resembles modern technology, but we lose most of it. This is not something where like the technology was preserved, passed down to the Western Europeans, and then eventually made it to the Americas. No, this technology is erased from historical memory with the fall of the Roman Empire. Right? So we redevelop some of this technology generations later, right? We developed this technology generations later. So this is not that we don't have a direct link to this technology. It just so happens that we also develop it later. Right? I want to be clear because sometimes it's very easy to get caught up in like, see, they had running water. We have running water. Therefore we got it from the Romans. No, we didn't get it from the Romans. We had to reinvent it. But the Romans did very much have it. So one of those technological marvels is the aqueducts. And by the way, Genesis, I saw your comment and we're good, don't worry. But aqueducts are really important because one of the main things a city has to figure out is how it's going to get water. Right? We need water to survive. And so one of the challenges, right, we talked about this earlier, even in modern cities, ancient cities, about how water needs to be transported from whatever the water source is to where the farming is actually occurring. And one of the things that the Romans develop is aqueducts, over a dozen aqueducts, bringing over 1 million cubic meters of fresh water into the city of Rome. The aqueducts are primarily, you see them in Rome, and that's where you see a lot of the best technology that the Romans developed, but they do spread some of that technology to the conquered areas, right? What the aqueducts allow them to have is running water in the city. This doesn't mean that every home had running water. Not every home had it. Some very wealthy homes would have had it, but most people would have to go into public areas to access the water being brought in by aqueducts. Right. One of the ways they did that was through public fountains and pools. Right. So you didn't have, the the water in your home, but if you lived in Rome or in a city, you had the water usually on like every street corner or nearly every street corner. And so it was easily accessible. You could go get water, bring it home. There was also over 900 public and private baths. And I'm not talking about bathrooms. We're talking about baths, and I'll get to that in a second because baths play a really important part of socializing in during the empire. A lot of it, though, these aqueducts have to be maintained because as the water flows through them, sometimes there would be debris caught in the aqueducts, right? That would stop the flow of the water. Or things would break down and they would stop the flow of the water. And so the way they were maintained was through slavery, right? It was through slavery. We think somewhere around 700 slaves maintained the Roman aqueducts, right? There were some of them, these aqueduct projects were begun during the Republic, but it was during, but a lot of every emperor, one of the ways in which they maintained power was by maintaining public infrastructure, right? They used the wealth they were gaining via building, empire building, to maintain and create more aqueducts, right? It was one of the things that they gave back to the Roman people was some of this technology. I mean, the way they're getting the money is through conquering and warfare. So not great, but this is how people stayed happy with the emperors. The water system then in Rome was really unique. It was actually based on a continual flow system. So you didn't turn on a faucet. You didn't turn on the public water fountains. No, it was constantly running. So if nobody used the water, it would just flow out, flow in, flow out. It was just and it was constantly coming in. There were no pumps. Um, the way that worked then was via slopes. The way that they organized the piping essentially from the aqueducts was that they would set it up so that the water was running from outside of Rome towards inside on a kind of hill. And so it didn't need anybody to be pumping it or to be doing anything to it. It's just on itself. Gravity took care of it. It flowed downhill, which is dead. And that made sure it got water into every Roman household. Right. So again, this was not in every home, but everyone within a city usually had access to clean drinking water. And so drinking water was really important. There were times in which some of the sources were polluted, and those became really big deals. Emperors typically mobilized very quickly to assure everyone that the water they were drinking was clean. In fact, it was really controversial. I mean, you couldn't even go to the water source and stick your feet in it because it would cause a major public issue if anybody was caught even putting their feet into public drinking water. Now, the family home um, in Rome is really interesting. So this is for the kind of for people who have the money to establish this kind of home, right? There would be some sort of like two central areas, one in kind of inside-ish, and then a kind of garden also. The male was the head of household, and there was usually some sort of um, place where the male head of household could sit and like welcome guests for festivities and things like that. Most Roman homes, though, were really bare. Like they wouldn't have a lot of furniture typically. They would have like chairs and places like things like that would get brought in whenever there was a gathering or some a festivity. But otherwise, things were pretty bare, except for the walls. The walls was where a lot of the artwork and tapestries and things would get displayed like that. And usually walls would be covered in some form of artwork. A lot of the way the houses would build would be minimum out of stone, but other uh, kind of more expensive materials could use marble for the flooring. Things like that were very common, especially the more money a family had. If you were poor, typical anywhere in the world where you're poor, life kind of sucked. Right? So you might not have your own home, but you might live in an insulae, which is kind of apartment building. Really, it was an apartment building. These kind of apartment buildings, there were some built out of stone. There could be other less um, durable material used, but at least in some part of the building of these apartments, you would have some stone. And the way they're designed is usually at the bottom and outside, you would have kind of like storefronts, right? Like people operated businesses in the bottom level of these apartment buildings. And then you would have places of residency going all the way up. Right? There's also, you can't really tell in this image, but there would be a courtyard in the middle. And this is actually a good design. It helps promote community, right? When everybody's rooms look inward, right? Um, and and could be really useful like that. A lot of apartment buildings even today have this design, right? Of like it's all around, and then there's the courtyard in the middle, or maybe the playground or something in the middle for families. Later on, actually, when European cities get really crowded, they start coming back to this design for low income housing, especially it gets designed like this. But this is something that the Romans did have. All right, we get to the Roman baths. So the Roman baths are really interesting because people bathe in baths on a regular basis. Once a day, some people multiple times a day, and it was a communal activity. Right? There were public baths that were relatively cheap. Now, really wealthier people could afford to go to nicer baths, but there was also very accessible, very affordable baths that just most people would have had access to. Right? And it kind of embodied the ideal Roman way of living in a big city. Right? This is where you could communicate. Some of these baths really were more like gyms in a way. You could go play sports, right? And then dip into the baths, or um, base, they didn't have the same kind of gym equipment, but you went and did the kind of sports for it. And part of the activity was that you would play with friends, neighbors, or with anybody that was there, and then dip into the bath. So there was a lot of social interaction happening in the baths. Uh, Ah, does this play into the spread of disease in the article? Initially, oh, sorry. Initially, no. The baths were really well maintained. Um, and so there was not, the baths were not like centers of disease at all because the water was continuous, right? They would, so they would often be like coming in, the water, it would be fresh basically every time. So they did not actually have problem of disease in the baths. Right? There would be some small bathhouses that would be privately owned, uh, but 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 there were always public baths. Right? And then some really large ones that could take over like a whole city block. And that's kind of amazing. That's how it tells you how important the Roman baths were to the Romans, because you could take up the whole street with these baths and there would be enough people coming using the facilities on a regular basis. Yeah, they were in a lot of ways kind of ahead of their times. Yeah, sanitation was an issue in Rome. I don't know if I have it. But the Romans did come up with a sewage system, because right away, I mean, one of the problems in cities is always that of sewage and what to do with waste. And so they basically had pipes that would take all the used water out of the city. And it was not being dumped in the same place that the drinking water was collected from. This was a problem that a lot of cities ran into later on. A lot of like Western European cities during the Middle Ages, the drinking water and the waste was not separated. It all came from the same, like it all, the water, the waste was dumped in the same place where you got your drinking water, which is not healthy. The Romans separated that. And so that also helps explain why they didn't have an issue of disease in these baths, right? And that they were affordable. Now, one big distinction that was made was gender. You never had gender mixing at the baths ever. That was a big no-no. Both genders, both men and women, used the same facilities, but they would have a different times. The best times were usually for the men, and women, they got to use the baths usually early in the morning, and basically in times when the men were not using the baths. But it was very gender segregated, and it was not okay to ever have like women in during the male hours or men during the female hours at the baths. Right? So there were gender differences here. Now, gladiator games. What do you know about the gladiators? Because usually, even just via pop culture, you know a lot about the gladiator games. Blood, coliseums.
It was like their modern theater back in the day where they would just go watch and entertain themselves.
Yes, they don't have television, they don't have movies. They had gladiator games. Yes. And they could be respected and looked upon. They were gladiators. They became celebrities. A lot of times the gladiators, yes. But it was also, it could be a fight to the death. Most of the time it wasn't, though. That is one of the things that stayed there. Although it was used as a punishment for criminals. Um, Even SpongeBob SquarePants had an episode on the Gladiator games. I missed that SpongeBob episode. Really, Ariana? You had a dress up event in the middle of school? You could gain your freedom via the Gladiator game, but it was very rare. It was very rare. So initially, the Gladiator games began as funeral games. Like somebody would die, and out of celebrating the death, trying to celebrate the life of the person that had died, you would have these small scale gaming events that became then the gladiator games. These games are really important because you see them depicted in all of the artwork that comes out of the Roman Empire. The gladiator games began during the Republic, but throughout all of the artwork, you see depictions of the gladiatorial games. Yeah. Um, so at first, right, you had pairs of gladiators who fought to the death. They did fight to the death in these early games, and then but then they became public spectacles, right? The politicians would organize gladiator tournaments and games, and this was another way in which politicians appealed to the public in a way in which they maintained their popularity, right? Sometimes if there was some other issue going on and the emperor was concerned about, how the public was going to be receiving something, they would stage a huge gladiator tournament or a huge gladiator game. And now people are distracted watching gladiators instead of worrying about the politics. So it's a great kind of like PR move, a way to keep people uh, from getting too mad at the emperors or the politicians. So at first, they were just the gladiator games would just take place in like open spaces with temporary seating. But eventually, you got these amphitheaters, right, where the seating would go all the way around. This was another kind of like innovation from the Romans that was then all, and we still use this design, right? But this way, everybody could see, right, what was happening in the center. You can visit the gladiator, the Colosseum, especially, was one of the greatest arenas for the gladiator games. And what you can see here is that this would have all been covered in like sand, would have all been covered. There was a whole world underneath what the public saw. And down here was where the gladiators would wait their turn, or maybe do a little bit of training. If there was any animals used during the games, they would be waiting out here. And sometimes you would have like trap doors in the middle of the arena. They would just open up and a gladiator would pop up or an animal would pop up, and that made the crowds go wild, right? So this is all like what was underneath the Colosseum. So this was the biggest arena for the um, gladiator games. Let me see, what are you putting in the chat? The Rose Bowl, absolutely. These are all this, or the Forum there, and that directly even make connections to the Roman designs of these arena. They filled it with water too. Sometimes they would, yes, they could fill some of these areas with water, and then it would become like a water arena. Yep. And these coliseums get built throughout the empire. I mean, I think I forgot to include my pictures in here. And yeah, because I have to go into Facebook to find my pictures that I took during this time. But you can find it as high up as, the UK, but you find these same kind of amphitheaters all over North Africa and all over the Mediterranean, because that was all Roman Empire territory. And this then they had training schools. So big were the gladiator games, right, that they would have schools in certain parts of Rome to train gladiators. And these were the training school at Capua was one of the most like the elite training schools for gladiators. This is another one, the amphitheater at Puzzoli, where you can see kind of that arch design with all this under what would have been underneath the arena. So how many of you have seen, what's that show called? Is it called Spartacus? It's not even on HBO. Where is it at? I have a picture somewhere here. Yes, Spartacus. It's like on Showtime or one of those. Have any of you seen that show? I'm like, they actually, except for the blood, the way that they depict the blood splattering like that. Oh, it is on Netflix now, but I think it originally aired on one of the paid channels. It's actually quite very well done and quite historically accurate, except for the blood splatter. They do a very cinematic, very dramatic blood splatter, and I'm like, blood does not splatter like that. But otherwise, there's a really good depiction, and they have really good scenes and recreations of the training schools, and the arenas. Now, gladiators themselves were typically condemned criminals, prisoners of war, and slaves. Right? There were some, though. Gladiators became so popular, and some of them were like celebrities, that there were people who volunteered to be gladiators. So you could volunteer if you were a man. If you were a woman, chances are you were not going to be a gladiator. There are hints of some women in the gladiator games, but typically that was not done. It was typically men. In the source, you will see Perpetua in a version of this, but she's not a gladiator per se. This was just a way of punishing criminals. What you're seeing, the arenas become very popular for that. If you became a gladiator, you do have to give an oath. This was the oath that the gladiators gave. I will endure to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. Are any of you volunteering? Would any of you have made good gladiators?
I'd be the worst.
I'm not seeing any hands raised for people volunteering for gladiators. Let me see the chat. Lilia, you'd be done. And maybe for a woman gladiator was more of a possibility. You weren't, if you were a woman, you would not be allowed in the Olympic Games. They were the Olympic Games were not for women. The Spartans had been the only ones that had allowed women to even train, but the Olympics Games were just for men. Christian undefeated. I mean, a lot of it was like a combination of like a lot of the popular like MMA fighting, WWE, like it involved all of that, right? Because you needed the physical ability to be able to do it, but you also needed the showmanship, right? The best gladiators, the most popular gladiators provided entertainment value out of it, right? People went to get entertained. Um, how many of you have seen the movie Gladiator? No, no one? I'm like, oh, thank God. Usually a few people have seen it. Okay, some people have seen it. It's always on television, on reruns. Um, it's a well done movie. I mean, it deserved a lot of the awards that happened to it, but it's an older movie now. Yeah, I have to admit, I found that movie to be so boring. I fell asleep in the middle of it. But maybe it's because I don't find men beating each other up to be very entertaining. So maybe I would not have been a good Roman. One of the things that is really interesting too about the gladiators is that you would have different kinds of them, right? So a lot of gladiators specialized in something, provided a particular kind of entertainment. So one of the more interesting ones to me is the Murmillo, um, which translates to fish. This is like a fish gladiator. Uh, got its name after a Greek saltwater fish. You can usually tell them that they're in the arena because of the helmets that they had on and that they got to carry a shield. That was not always UFC. Okay, see, I'm not up on all my people beating each other up. um, so, but this is how you can tell this fish gladiator. Um, you would also have some gladiators that would specialize in working with animals. And these gladiators would usually get trained on how to handle and fight animals. You didn't want to do that. Working with animals is not easy, and animals cannot always be controlled. So the bestiarius, the animal fighter, was usually a very low ranking gladiator. And I'm guessing they were not around that long. They would probably often do the wrong thing with a big cat and you know. It's very easy to lose a limb to a big angry animal. So you didn't want to be that guy. um, but uh, but you would want to attend one of the gladiatorial schools. These schools would typically be under the control of the emperor. Right. This was both entertainment and a kind of political maneuvering that the emperors did. Right. Now, what do you know about Spartacus? He's become a very well-known figure. Most people, if I say the name Spartacus, you can connect him and say he's a gladiator. But how much of the story of Spartacus do you know? He led a rebellion, and Julius Caesar is finally the one who's able to, or he comes after him. Yeah, it was this. So the Spartacus rebellion was actually during the Roman Republic. It was the end of the Roman Republic there, on the beginning of the empire. He Spartacus himself was a freeborn man from a province in the Roman Empire, Thrace. There is some evidence that he may have served in the Roman army in Macedonia, but some of that information is sketchy. What we know is that he escapes from the gladiator arena, right? Oh, sorry, he first deserts the army, is outlawed, is captured, sold into slavery, and that's how he ends up as a gladiator, right? He did, and he ends up at a gladiatorial school in Capua, and he becomes one of the most famous gladiators at the time and since then. Right? But he really becomes famous because of the rebellion. In the year 73 BCE, he escaped with somewhere between 70 and 80 gladiators. Right? And this is one of the things that does come up in that show, Spartacus. Um, and um, and you see Crixus and Almomeus in this show, but those were his kind of chief, like lieutenants in the rebellion. The Senate immediately mobilizes after the escape of the gladiators to put down this rebellion. They first send a praetor, Claudius Glaber, with 3,000 raw recruits. So these were not seasoned military men that are sent after the gladiators at first, because the Senate believes that they can crush this rebellion very easily, right? They think, oh, you just have, uh, some escaped gladiators. We're better than them. We can suppress this rebellion really quickly. Well, no, the 3,000 raw recruits were no match against at least 70 trained gladiators, 70 trained and organized gladiators. Right? There is evidence that Spartacus himself was not interested in rebellion. Like, that was not his, he didn't have a lot of political motivations. Spartacus escaped because he didn't want to be a gladiator, right? He actually, his goal was to escape across the Alps, right? Then two of the other gladiators, the Gauls and the Germans, in the group of gladiators that escaped, actually wanted to stay and like plunder, right? So their motivation was not political, but there's a lot of political meaning that people have extracted out of this, right? A lot of scholars in the modern era, especially Marxist scholars, view the Spartacus rebellion as a kind of working class revolution, right? And that these were people at the bottom of the social chain who managed to, you know, fight our Roman soldiers and to win. And that this was a kind of class struggle, right? That is probably an interpretation that over exaggerates what the gladiators actually wanted. It There's no evidence that there was that kind of class struggle in the minds of the gladiators that escaped. They just wanted their freedom. Some of them wanted to just, you know, uh, take whatever wealth they could get and get out. Spartacus himself probably just wanted out, period. But he held on. He held off Roman armies for years. It took years to finally put down the rebellion. But yeah, it was finally put down at the end of the Republic. So, all right, what can the Romans teach us? Why do we care so much about Roman history? Why are there all kinds of shows, movies? If you look up any aspect of Roman history online, you will have tons of results on your Google search. Why has there been so much written about Rome and the Roman Empire? None of you? They were so advanced for their time, but I'm like, I'm not sure if they have been the most advanced. I'm like, we don't care in the same way about like Muslim advancements, technological advancements. The Muslim controlled territory made significant advancements, especially in intellectual fields. The Chinese made big technological advancements that made an impact in history that's closer to us, more recent history. And then the Romans, a lot of the advancements of the Romans disappear. With the fall of Rome, they disappear. It is very interesting. And there's something to be said about just history for its own sake. As a historian, I tend to like that and agree that, hey, there's something interesting there and it's worth telling. The technology is very interesting. A lot of it, I think there's a little bit less in this country, but in other parts of the world, it becomes very much about what we can learn from Rome, right? Not just its technology, but also from the fall of Rome. People feel like when you look at empires and you see the rise and fall, the Roman Empire can provide a kind of template, right? If you can figure out what went wrong with the Roman Empire, how they lasted so long and then just crashed, then maybe you can fix modern day issues. Sometimes people talk about the American Empire and how the American Empire is in its decline and how it can avoid the mistakes that Rome made. We don't always make that connection. I think that's less popular amongst our politicians and in our pop culture than it is in Britain. In Britain, the Roman Empire tends to be used as an example a lot in modern day politics and in modern day discussions. Right? And I mean, it's still politicians come out and make their comparisons to the fall of the Roman Empire all the time. Like almost every time I turn on, I look up British news, some politician is talking about the fall of the Roman Empire. Especially, a lot of those comparisons came up during the debate in the UK over Brexit. Who knows what Brexit is and can give us at least part of this quick summary of what Brexit is? I'm like, no one knows the recent European stuff. The UK, yeah. So the UK for a long time has been part of the European Union. So it's an economic and political agreement made by European countries after World War II. The British were never so excited about being part of the European Union. They're an island, right? there's the island of Britain, and then there's the continent of Europe, right? And they see themselves as separate, right? One, for a large part of their history, they've been at war with the continental powers. So they see themselves as different, separate, and better. And so they struggled a lot with even being part of a European Union recently, but they have been part of the European Union, except for certain things like their money. In Britain, they kept the British pound rather than adopting the euro. But otherwise, like being part of the European Union had brought the UK a lot of advantages. For example, if you had a European Union passport, you could travel within any of the member states without any problem, right? But in recent years, there was a move to get out of the EU. And basically, there was a vote in Britain, and the British people voted to leave the EU. This was seen as a wave of populism, and something that ended up being deeply connected to American politics. So, for example, Trump really supported Brexit, and the politicians that had been behind the big Brexit move. So let me see if this will play. Will it play? Oh, you're good, Genesis. Let me see. I won't play all of it, but John Oliver, as a former, well, he is a Brit, but he's now an American citizen himself. Okay, maybe it won't play. Anyways, if you ever find yourself needing to look up Brexit, John Oliver does really funny summaries of what Brexit is, and also kind of ridicules why the British wanted to leave the European Union. But one of the main reasons that was behind that push and that vote to leave the European Union was that the EU mandated that all its member states had to accept a certain amount of refugees. Right? There were a large number of refugees leaving places like Syria, which has been experiencing years of warfare. Right? So people leaving and going to your Western European countries. And it became such a big problem that the EU mandated that everyone who's part of the EU had to accept a certain number of immigrants or refugees. Right? There's a significant wave of anti-immigrant feeling all over Europe. Right? Immigration since World War II has been rising in Europe in the kind of numbers that they had never seen before. And if you think the US is bad at dealing with issues of immigration and refugees, the Europeans are even worse in a lot of ways. Right? It's not a race to the bottom. It's not about who's worse, but they have struggled a lot with that because they had not experienced that kind of level of people coming in. And so there's a lot of nativism in Western Europe, so in Germany and France and in the UK. So a lot of anti-immigrant, anti-refugee sentiment. A lot of it is because they feel like immigrants and refugees are not like them. Right? A lot of refugees and immigrants are not Christian. A lot of them are Muslim. Some of them are practicing Muslim, and for a lot of white Europeans, that clashes. That's contradictory to what it means to be European. Some of that just sounds similar because it's very similar to the issues we have in the US. Some of the similar rhetoric that comes up. What does this all have to do with, with the Roman Empire? Well, one of the big lessons that some people get out of the fall of the Roman Empire is that the thing that weakened the Roman Empire was foreigners, accepting too many foreigners into the empire. People believe that that weakened Rome and that led directly towards its fall. If you believe that that is the problem that the Roman Empire had and the reason why it fell, and you think that that's the lesson we need to learn from the fall of the Roman Empire, then it directly connects to these ideas of anti-immigration and anti-refugees. Right? The direct connection here is, hey, this is what led to Rome falling, and we need to avoid that. That means that we have to stop immigrants and refugees from coming into our country in order to prevent the same mistake that the Romans made. What do you think is the problem with that kind of argument? Any ideas? It's very political. Christian, yeah.
I was gonna say it omits every other like possible factor.
Yes, it's like looking at one thing and making one thing like the cause of everything, when historians have largely discredited that as the cause of the fall of the Roman Empire. Yes. So in order to really understand, then we need to look at, all right, so what were the causes of the fall of the Roman Empire? And it turns out it's much more complex, and historians have changed their mind. The generation of historians that were writing in the 60s and 70s came up with a very different reason for the fall of the Roman Empire than modern day historians have. So let's talk about some of what contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire. One of the places, historians have no agreement on when the Roman Empire ends. There's no agreement. Some historians argue that it was in the 3rd century, in this period, because there's a period of years in the 3rd century here where you have so many different emperors. Some who ruled for less than a year, some for months, some for weeks, some for days. This is why you have many that have the year like 238. So just in the year 238, Rome had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different emperors. Other years, you see similar issues. What is the problem with this, with having so many emperors in such a short period of time? Why is this a bad thing? I'll come back. Oh, there is. No stability, different mindsets. Yes. For a while, the system of emperors in Rome works. For a while, it works. But by the time you get to the 3rd century, there's so much instability. And it becomes basically about who has the bigger army. Like, who has the bigger army? Who has the most military power? Because whoever has the most military power can control Rome and control the whole empire. And so this is just not sustainable, this kind of instability. And by the time we get to the 3rd century, there had just been a lot of political corruption, a lot of infighting. There was a Praetorian Guard, the equivalent of like the Secret Services that was meant to protect the emperor. But by the time you get to this crisis, they were basically deciding who got to be emperor. Whoever they sided with became emperor. And that led to a lot of chaos. So when the system of government is not functioning well enough to even have an emperor, does an empire even exist? Some historians look at this and they say no, right? They say this is not an empire. It's being held together with tape. What's going on? This is not sustainable, right? So this is what I just said. Then, though, after the 3rd century comes an emperor that seems to fix things. Maybe. Let's see what you think. Diocletian becomes emperor. He decides that the problem is that the empire's too big. It's too big for one person to rule over it. So he divides the empire into two. East is the green, and then the Western Empire is the red. So what he does then is declares himself the emperor of the Western Empire, and then there's a co-emperor, Maximian, who rules the East. So this way, there's two emperors, and then because one of the main problems is that of succession, right? Who gets to be emperor next? The emperor would pick a successor, who they gave the title of Caesar. So you'd have an emperor and a Caesar in the West, and then an emperor and a Caesar in the East. Right? Diocletian also passed a bunch of reforms that helps kind of put some of the economic problems, fix some of the economic problems that were happening. On top of it, in the year 305, he abdicated. He was getting older, he was getting sickly, and we think it was that his health was going downhill, and he realized that he didn't have a long time left to live. So he abdicates from being emperor, and he forces Maximian to also step down. That was brilliant in a way because it made sure that their chosen successor then became emperor, right? So it kept the continuity of the reigns going. Some people, though, say that what Diocletian did in dividing the empire in two, means there is no empire anymore. There's two empires. You have an empire to the west and one to the east. This isn't one empire. You have two emperors and two different systems. And there's a lot of truth to that. On the other hand, the argument against that, saying that there is still an empire, is that there is still just one legal system, right? If you passed a law, it applied to both places. It applied to both the East and the West. And also people to the East considered themselves part of the Roman Empire, and people to the West considered themselves part of the Roman Empire. So how can you say there were two empires when people consider themselves part of one empire? What do you guys think about this Diocletian move of splitting the empire in half? Is this the end of the empire? Do you have two, East and West? Or can we still say that this is still just one empire? It's a little divided. Might seem okay for him, less handling. You have to deal with less issues. Yeah, by splitting it in half like that. But some of you can see, right, why some historians say, no, there's no empire left. It's split. It's physically split in two. There's a line. But yes, for a lot of people, it's the power in the name. People didn't talk about two empires. People talked about Rome. Some people say, why maybe administratively there's no more one empire, there's two. Kind of emotionally, there's still one. Emotionally and legally, there's still just the one. So that is another possibility for when the Roman Empire ended, right? By the way, these do become two separate empires. To the east becomes Byzantium. Byzantium, under the system that Diocletian devised, so this to the east becomes Byzantium, gets stronger and stronger after this division. The empire to the west begins to weaken more and more, politically and also economically, right? One of the first historians to write he wrote a huge volume called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. The historian was Edward Gibbon. And he was one of these people that argued that one of the things that had made Rome great at first was being able to integrate foreigners into the empire, but that by the time you get to this point, it become a weakness. It was basically admitting too many foreigners into the empire. So although it had made it strong at first, it had now become a weakness. Right? That argument has been discredited. Most historians will not give you that answer if you ask them about the fall of the Roman Empire. But some of what he wrote has not been discredited by historians, right? Like, this is a quote from his book where he says, "The decline of Rome was the natural and inevitable effect of immoderate greatness. Prosperity ripened the principle of decay, the cost of destruction multiplied with the extent of conquest, and as soon as time or accident and removed the artificial supports, the stupendous fabric yielded to the pressure of its own weight. The story of the ruin is simple and obvious. And instead of inquiring why the Roman Empire was destroyed, we should rather be surprised that it has subsisted for so long." He's basically saying the right question is not why did the Roman Empire fall? The correct question is why did it last so long? It was never going to last. It was never, it didn't have a system that was going to exist forever. And going off of that, what historians now will argue is that there were multiple causes to the fall of the Roman Empire. More recently, so this is in like the last couple of decades, the focus has been on the environmental reasons for the fall of the Roman Empire. They're saying this is what precipitates, what basically makes the situation worse is the environmental problems that had begun happening in Rome for a while, right? And this is what the article for today made the case for, right? So what are some of the things that the article brought up? Climate change. And there was a climate change occur, right? What else? Or describe that climate change, because when we're talking about climate change, it can mean so much. Active volcanoes, yes. So some of it was human caused, but not all of it. Not all of the climate changes that were happening. Yeah. I'm like, the slide gives you some of the summary, right? One of the things that was caused by humans was deforestation, right? The wood needed to maintain fires, to build things, led to mass deforestation, right? And cities, the big cities that Rome was building all over the world, need a lot of wood, and that caused a lot of problems. The deforestation contributed to soil erosion. So a lot of the nutrients that made farming productive in Roman territories were no longer there, right? The agricultural techniques, right, weren't all there. And so basically you have a series of years of really bad agricultural yields. And if you don't have good agricultural yields, that means you don't have enough food to feed everyone. When you don't have enough food to feed everyone, they're going to be really unhappy. Right? They're going to be really unhappy and more likely to rebel and to want a different political system. right? One of the main job of political leaders, it makes sure everybody is alive, security, food, have these things. The Romans had also overhunted large chunks of their territory, and it had led to the extinction of a number of species. We know this despite the species being extinct through a lot of the artwork and even the like reliefs in Roman buildings. This is what a relief is, like the artwork that was carved into buildings. You see animals depicted in enough of the reliefs and the artwork that you know that these animals actually existed at the time, but no longer exist. And so we know then that a lot of these animals were became extinct because of hunting. Another main problem they have was the pollution. As cities grow and become bigger and bigger, they produce more and more waste. And even though there had, the aqueducts existed and there were sewage systems, they were created at a time in which the city was a particular size. You grow too much, and the sewage system can no longer accommodate for all of the pollution, the trash, all of the poop being generated in the city. And that leads to the disease, to waves of disease. And you do have waves of disease in the last decades of the empire in the cities. Also, the problem of being constantly at war. And the Romans were constantly at war, conquering new territory, putting down rebellions, and then with the so-called the barbarians attacking at every corner of the empire. It means you had to maintain large armies, right? Large armies. That means you have to be able to feed the armies. And because of the agricultural exhaustion and soil erosion, you can't. You no longer can feed large armies, but the army has to eat. So what's the army going to do? Rebel too. So rebel and go feed off the land. So feeding the army off the land was a strategy that they resorted to, and that makes people really unhappy, right? If the Roman army is walking through your town or your farm, they're going to destroy it. They're going to take what they need to eat and to survive, and good luck to you. So these are all problems. I've run out of time. All right, I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back to this because, like I said, the question of why Rome falls, there's not one agreement amongst historians. So you have to decide which argument makes more sense to you. Which argument do you think, which thing really marks the end of Rome? There's one more I need to present to you so that you can have all of the evidence available. There's one more moment that we can call the end of the Roman Empire. But, and then I didn't talk about active volcanoes. Yeah, active volcanoes create pollution, and it's bad for farming, it's bad for breathing. It's bad. All right, we'll come back to the environmental reasons, and then we'll talk about the barbarians on Wednesday. So we'll end here. You're free to go. If anybody has questions or comments about Rome, stay and we can chat. But otherwise, you're free to go. I will stop the recording.